The dog named Neva sat on the couch and didn't so much as whine in protest. It seemed as if this Neva was just about as loyal as the original. When we exited the office, 4 red shirts arrived, each carrying tasers. "Stand back," Namir ordered them. "I must not be harmed." The guards looked confused, or as I've written before, as confused as a dado can look. They kind of bumped into one another as they jockeyed to get out of our way. I ran to the door that led to the cellar and the flume. "Go," I commanded, after opening it. Alder pushed Namir ahead and down the stairs. I looked back at the dado guards and said, "You bozos wait here. We won't be long." I closed the door, leaving them standing there, befuddled. "What is the point?" Namir asked as Alder wrestled him down the stairs and through the basement. "Do you think taking me away from Second Earth will change anything? Ravinia is more powerful than any one man. All will continue as planned whether I'm here or not. This is all so futile." "Maybe," I said. "Maybe not. We'll know for sure in a couple of minutes." "What? How?" Namir asked. "We're going to see the future." We stopped at the wooden door with the star, the gate to the flume. I took a second and touched the star symbol that had been burned into the door. "This star used to represent something special," I said to Namir. "Something bigger than all of us. This star said Hala, but you took it and made it into something small and hateful. You feel good about that?" Namir lifted an eyebrow and said, "What makes you think that star ever represented anything other than the pursuit of perfection that is Ravinia?" I wanted to hit the guy, especially if he was right. I didn't want to believe that the star was put at all the gates solely to mark the way for St. Dane's crusade. That would have been too horrifying to even think of. So I didn't. I pulled open the door and motioned for Alder to take him into the root cellar. "We'll all travel together," I said as I stepped into the mouth of the flume. "I don't want to risk this guy getting away and—" The flume came to life. It began to crack and writhe as light appeared in the deep distance. I shot a look to Alder. I wasn't sure why. He didn't have any more answers than I did. "This is my lucky day," Namir said with a confident grin. "It looks as if I'm to be receiving additional guests." I jumped out of the flume and stood with Alder and Namir, our backs to the far wall. The gray stones of the flume turned to crystal. A shadow appeared. A tall shadow. A single traveler had arrived. He walked slowly from the depths of the flume and stood with the light at his back. The light didn't disappear. That meant only one thing.
"I'm honored that you've all come to greet my return,"
St. Dane said.
"I trust you're getting acquainted."
"We're taking him out of here," I shouted. St. Dane laughed.
"Why would you do that? You wouldn't want him to miss all the fun, would you?"
"Let's go," I growled to Alder, taking his arm and pulling him toward the flume. I didn't care if St. Dane was there. I was ready to bowl him over. We had to get Namir away from Second Earth. We had to change the future. It was going to be harder than I thought. More shadows appeared from deep within the flume, walking toward us in 2 military-like lines. Alder and I stopped short.
"Dados,"
he declared. They all wore the red-shirt uniforms of Namir's guardians. Namir was right. It was going to be a lot more difficult leaving the house than it had been getting in. We weren't ready to give up. I spotted the 2 dado-killing rods that we had brought from Pendragon. They were still on the dirt floor where we had dropped them when we were tasered on our arrival. "Let him go," I commanded Alder, while diving to the ground and grabbing the rods. Alder pushed Namir away. I tossed him a weapon. St. Dane stood in the center of the flume with his legs apart and his arms folded. He wasn't about to move.
"Must you always be so difficult, Pendragon?"
he asked, bored. Yeah," was my answer, and the fight was on. The dados jogged past St. Dane on either side of the demon, headed for us. I dropped my rod down to my waist, ready to use it like a prod. I nailed the first dado in line, instantly feeling his power going out. I pulled the weapon back and jammed again at the second. They didn't know what hit them. Wherever these dados came from, it wasn't Quillen. They knew nothing about the power of these weapons. We had a chance. Namir ran from the root cellar. I didn't care. We had to get out of there and go to Third Earth, where we could figure out another plan of attack. Alder took out the dados one by one. The bodies were piling up, but more red shirts marched from the depths of the flume. Many more. I heard Alder gasp. He'd been hit. I wasn't sure by what. A taser? The butt of a gun? He staggered. I went to him to try and keep the dados off him. It was the last move I made. There were too many of them. As soon as I jumped to Alder's defense, I felt a sharp shot to the back of my head. I fell forward, dropping the weapon. Alder was already out. I was on my knees, about to join him. I took another shot to the side of my head and went down, hard. The last thing I remember seeing was St. Dane's smiling face looking down at me. "Always the hard way," he said, shaking his head. Journal number 36, continued. 2nd Earth.
How are you feeling?
It was a deep voice that sounded vaguely familiar. How was I feeling? I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Like I was hit by a bus," I croaked. Of course, I'd never actually been hit by a bus, but I was pretty sure that this was what it would feel like. I struggled to pull myself out of the dark pit of the unconscious, knowing that when I got out, I wouldn't want to be where I found myself. I opened my eyes. At least I think I did. It was hard to tell, because everything was black. "Alder?" I asked.
"He is fine,"
came the deep voice. Who was that? Why did he sound so familiar? I blinked. It didn't change anything other than to make my head hurt. I decided not to blink any more. I was lying out flat on something soft. At least somebody had tried to make me comfortable. Good for them, whoever they were.
"Over here, Pendragon,"
the voice said. The third time was the charm. I recognized the voice. I wanted to be unconscious again. I looked toward my feet to see him standing over me, lit by a small lamp near the end of the couch I was on. The light hit him from below, like when you hold a flashlight under your chin to look all spooky. But St. Dane didn't really need any lighting effects to help with his creep appeal. He loomed over me like a vulture, his bald head in shadow caused by the light of the single bulb.
"Welcome back,"
he said warmly, as if he actually meant it.
"I was afraid you'd miss the festivities. Close your eyes. I'll put some lights on."
What a courteous guy. He didn't want me to be uncomfortable when he flicked on the lights. How thoughtful. I'd have thanked him if I hadn't wanted to hurt him. St. Dane walked slowly to a wall panel and turned a dimmer switch. The room slowly grew brighter, and I got a view of the space. It looked like the waiting room at a doctor's office. I didn't think for a second that St. Dane would have taken me to a doctor. There were a couple of couches and chairs with tables. One whole wall was covered by heavy red drapes that were probably blocking a window. I was lying on a couch along one wall. My head hurt. I wasn't sure if I'd been knocked out by getting hit or being tasered. Probably both. Bottom line was, I felt like I had been hit by a bus. St. Dane walked toward me. Except for the fact that he had lost his gray hair when his head caught fire a while back, the guy hadn't changed a bit since the day I'd first seen him. He still stood tall and ramrod straight. He still wore that black suit. He still had those blue-white eyes that burned into my head whenever he looked my way. He still made my skin crawl. "Can I ask you a question?" I said groggily.
"I'd be disappointed if you didn't."
"How many of those suits do you have? Do you, send them to the laundry, or just toss them out and put on a new one when it gets all gamey?" St. Dane chuckled. I amused him.
"Does it matter?"
he asked. It was a joke, idiot. On top of everything else wrong with him, St. Dane didn't have much of a sense of humor. Except when I amused him, which happened a lot, I'm sorry to say.
I'm glad to see that you're in a good mood. You should be. Our struggle has finally come to an end. Perhaps we should celebrate.
Perhaps you should bite me. St. Dane cocked his head, confused.
I'm afraid I don't understand that remark, but I'll assume it's a provocation. There's no need for hostility between us any more, Pendragon.
I'll be the judge of that. He sat down in a chair across from me. I tried to sit up, but decided my aching head preferred that I stay on my back. What the heck? I didn't need to be polite to this guy.
You'll soon learn that I speak the truth,
St. Dane said calmly.
The convergence is well underway. The territories are becoming one. All is as I anticipated it would be. Our duel is complete.
You keep talking as if this were a contest between us, I said.
It is. It was.
Then why didn't somebody tell me that from the beginning? You can't have a competition when only one side knows the rules.
It was the only way,
St. Dane explained.
This has been a battle to determine the future of Hala, though not in the conventional sense. If you were to have understood the stakes from the beginning, it would not have been a fair demonstration.
Demonstration of what?
The quest for control of Hala was never about armies, or physical strength, or even technology. It was about a battle between two basic philosophical differences. It was about determining which is the more effective way to play out one's destiny, by chance or by design. I, of course, believe in design. You and your sort prefer to let fate lead you where it may. If you knew that issue was at the core of our struggle, you would not have had a fair chance to prove your philosophy.
I finally sat up. I didn't care that my head was being pounded by a sledgehammer. What philosophy? I don't have any philosophy.
But you do. At every turn you have made choices based on the belief that the people of Hala know what is best for them. Correct?
I didn't answer.
Press told you that the territories should never be mixed. Each culture, each society, each world, each individual should be given the chance to live its own destiny without interference. Am I wrong?
No,
of course not. And I have proved time and again that the people of Hala will consistently make the wrong choices.
Because you've pushed them into making the wrong choices, I exclaimed.
Only to prove my point. Do you honestly think the battles we've been through are the only cases of misery in the history of Hala? Pendragon, I know you are still just a boy, but certainly you know that each world has its own legacy of violence and strife that has nothing whatsoever to do with me. I didn't invent conflict. Quite the opposite. I'm trying to end it.
My head hurt, and not just because I'd been beaten up. So what? I exclaimed. What's the point? Let's pretend you're not lying. Again. Let's say that everything that's happened between us was all some huge philosophical debate that used the people of Hala as pawns. Why? Who are we trying to prove something to? Who's running this, St. Dane? What's the prize? If this war is truly over, then it won't make any difference if you let me know what's going on. St. Dane blinked. I saw it. He didn't answer right away either. It was the best possible response I could have hoped for. I smiled. It's not over, is it?
It was over when you quit, Pendragon.
He spat at me.
It was the ultimate display of weakness. You are incapable of making difficult decisions. You flinch in the face of adversity. Your so-called morals have been your downfall. When you buried the flume on Abara, it opened the door for the convergence.
But it isn't over, is it? I said, goading him. St. Dane's face grew dark. His eyes flared. He stood quickly and strode to the panel with the dimmer switch. He hit another button. The red drapes that covered the one wall parted automatically. I struggled to stand and look at what was being revealed. There was a long glass window, but it didn't look outside. I had heard all about this place from Mark and Courtney and Patrick, but seeing it was still a shock. Hearing about it and seeing it for myself were two different animals. I couldn't breathe. The window overlooked a huge room that seemed to me like a cathedral or a big theater. There were multiple rows of green seats, all facing the same direction, with a center aisle dividing them. It was exactly as my friends had described it. It wasn't a cathedral. It wasn't a theater. Roughly 10 yards in front of the seats was the flume.
"Look familiar?"
St. Dane asked.
"This is the flume that was unearthed next to the subway tracks in the Bronx. It's now the Conclave of Ravinia."
The room we were in was some kind of private viewing area that overlooked the seats from a level above. To the rear of the huge space was a wide staircase. I saw people coming down and filling up the rows. They could have been arriving for a church service, or a movie, or a school play. There were all kinds of people, all races, all ages. I saw families with little kids and people who arrived alone. They all seemed to be dressed pretty well. Some had what looked like traditional costumes from other countries, and some even wore military uniforms. They filed in quickly and quietly. Several of the red-shirt guards were stationed around, leading people to their seats like ushers. They didn't have guns. I wondered if the people knew they were robots. There were 2 flags on stands up front, one on either side of the flume. There was an American flag and a red flag that had the star symbol on it. St. Dane and I stood there, looking down at the growing crowd. He let me take in the scene for a few minutes before speaking again.
"This conclave is the prototype," he explained. "The first. It will be repeated throughout Hala. I will admit to you, though the end result was never in doubt, events did not play out precisely as I anticipated."
"So what's different?" I asked.
"I fully expected you to become the leader of Ravinia."
I laughed. "Me? You thought I was going to be like that guy Namir?" St. Dane nodded.
"How many times have I asked you to join me? I felt certain that eventually you would see reason and take your place at the forefront of this movement. I was wrong. It was not meant to be. I'm not sure if I should commend you or pity you."
"There was 0 chance of that happening."
"Apparently. And so the honor went to Namir. He is now the traveler from Second Earth and the leader of a revolution. Your loss."
"What's this all about?" I asked, gesturing to the rapidly filling space below. "What are they doing here?"
"Namir was given the key to Hala,"
St. Dane answered, pointing to the traveler ring on my finger.
"A key you have as well, but Namir was not afraid to use it for more meaningful pursuits than sending mail. He opened the door for the chosen, the Ravinians. They will be the leaders of a new Hala. The same will happen on each and every world. The truth of the grander existence of man will be revealed to those who are worthy of leading the way. Those people down there are the first. Many more are joining every day from all over the world. They are not necessarily people of wealth or power, but they share a common philosophy. They do not tolerate anything less than absolute perfection."
"There's no such thing as perfection," I countered. His eyes flared. His lips curled into a smirk.
"Not yet."
I wanted to hit the guy.
"Weakness will not be tolerated on any level. The advancement of our societies will be the singular goal. It is all about the greater good. There will be no room for pity or second-guessing."
"And no room for humanity," I added.
"Humanity is nothing more than an acceptance of failure. We do not accept failure. The goal is too great."
"What exactly is that goal?" I asked.
"Utopia."
I had to let that sink in. St. Dane really believed he was working to create an ideal Hala. Trouble was, There was no place in that ideal world for most of the people already in it. "What about Third Earth?" I asked. "You destroyed an ideal society. That's not exactly utopia."
"It is no longer about territories, Pendragon. There were 10 territories, but only 7 worlds in Hala. Each will have to be torn down and stripped of its prior imperfections before it can be allowed to truly flourish. What happens on Earth is simply part of that process."
"Do those people down there know that they're setting something in motion that will lead to the ruin of their own society?" I asked. St. Dane chuckled. I was amusing him again.
"They know sacrifices must be made. They accept that. Part of their strength is the ability to make difficult choices. That's why it was so important to reveal the true nature of Hala. They understand there is life beyond the few meager years they will spend here. They are working to create a perfect, eternal life for themselves as citizens of Hala. The same will happen on each world. It will begin with conclaves such as this. The strong will join together to unify Hala. There will no longer be barriers." Things were becoming clear to me, and totally overwhelming. The convergence was going to create a single unified Hala that was under the control of St. Dane. For the first time, I was beginning to see how it might be possible. "You know you're a total hypocrite," I said. "And how is that?"
"You've based your whole philosophy on the fact that the people of the territories make dumb, selfish choices that hurt them in the long run. Yet that's exactly what you're taking advantage of. You're tempting these people with the promise of some kind of perfect existence. Aren't those people down there being just as selfish as anybody else? I guess that means you think it's okay to be selfish, so long as it helps you get what you want."
"There is a difference,"
St. Dane replied.
"Yes, I've influenced these people through Namir. I've tempted them. I've given them hope for a better world. But in this case, the choice was mine, and I am correct. If Hala is to flourish, my way is the only way. These people simply recognize that fact."
I looked at the demon, who was keeping his eyes on the people as they filed in. The room was nearly full. "Then what have you proved?" I asked. "Only that people will always try to make a better life for themselves."
"I have proved that left to their own devices, they will never find it. People need guidance from a higher authority, someone with vision. I have that vision. It will now become a reality."
"This is insane. You can't create 2 different classes and think that the normal people of the world will let it happen. No way."
"Then how do you explain the stand taken by the United Nations? That august, respected voice of this world will vote tomorrow to adopt our positive way of thinking as an international standard. Is any more validation needed than that? People want simple answers, Pendragon. They want to be shown how things can be made better. They're tired of pulling the dead weight of society. Ravinia gives them the chance to fly, not just survive."
"What happens to those who don't fit your perfect profile?" I asked.
"They will perform important functions. There will always be a need for pure, simple laborers."
"Slaves," I said with disdain.
"Call it what you like."
"They'll try to stop you," I warned.
"They will regret it,"
St. Dane said ominously. Before I could ask him what he meant by that, a door opened to the rear of the room. 2 red shirts entered, followed by 2 more. It took 4 of them to keep Alder under control.
"Ah, our dear friend from Pendragon,"
St. Dane exclaimed.
"Just in time."
Alder's hands were tied in front of him. I imagined the hard time he had given the Dados. "You all right?" I asked. He nodded. I saw a huge black and blue mark on his cheek. I wondered how many of the Dados he took out before they stopped him. 2 of the red shirts left. The other 2 stayed and stood inside the door. I guess they were expecting more trouble.
"Look!"
St. Dane exclaimed, gesturing to the viewing window.
"It begins."
Alder and I stood together at the window and looked down. The place was packed. Every last seat was taken. The lights went dark. I felt a collective rush of anticipation from the people below. Everyone was at attention, waiting for... what? A pin spot of light hit a sole figure that stood near the mouth of the flume. Namir. He wore a long, dark robe, making him look like a monk. The crowd gasped, as if they were in the presence of a rock star. "Behold!" Namir's amplified voice boomed. "Hala!" Namir held up his fist. Beams of laser-like light shot from his ring, spraying the room with color. The light danced over the faces of the assembled, who let out a collective sigh. They all had these serene looks, as if they were being kissed by 1,000 tiny angels. I was less impressed. It was the same kind of light that sprang from the flume whenever it was activated. Okay, maybe I never saw it come from a traveler's ring, but still, it wasn't all that new to me. I found myself rubbing my own ring. I had no idea it contained that kind of power. I looked at Alder. He stared at the spectacle, expressionless. The light flashed into the flume. Instantly, the gray rocks of the tunnel began to glow. Namir had activated the tunnel. The rocks turned crystal. Light sprang from the flume itself. Was somebody on the way in? A ball of light erupted from the mouth of the tunnel, creating a brilliant flash. When the flash subsided, it was my turn to gasp. 3-dimensional images floated near the mouth of the flume. Images of Hala, the island city afar from Chlorol, Namir announced. I saw the mountain city that had risen from beneath the sea. Hauler submarines floated around it, as if suspended in space. It was incredible. The image was clear, yet transparent. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I didn't think anybody else could either. No wonder they were all so impressed by Namir and his promises of other worlds. "Far will be the home for Ravinia on Chlorol," Namir's voice boomed. "As will the village of Leandra on Elong, and Zazu on Zadar. Each world will have its own conclave of Ravinia, as we have here in New York." My stomach now hurt as much as my head. It felt like a fantasy come true. A horrible, evil fantasy. As amazing and real as it was, I didn't get how these people could buy into it so easily. I mean, I knew it was real, but to the people of Earth, it just as easily could have been a hologram movie as a glimpse into another world. Why did they buy into it without any doubt? My answer came quickly. Shadows appeared through the image, moving forward. I soon realized they weren't shadows at all, but very real people, who were walking out of the flume. The brilliant images of Chlorol were sucked back in by the flume, as if it were a vacuum cleaner that controlled light. In a moment, the flume went dark, and a spotlight shone on a group of 5 people standing beyond the mouth. I didn't recognize any of them. They were 5 normal-looking people, 2 men and 3 women. They wore clothes from Second Earth. They stood together, holding hands. As soon as the light hit them, they raised their clasped hands in triumph. The crowd jumped to its feet with excitement while applauding and cheering. Another group of people ran from the side to greet the 5 who had arrived through the flume. They hugged and kissed as if they were greeting loved ones who had returned from a long trip, which is exactly what they were. Namir's voice proclaimed, "Our latest travelers back from Chlorol, where they enjoyed the wonders of that world of water."
"So it is true," Alder said softly. "Anyone can travel."
"With the help of Namir," I corrected. Namir continued, "Ravinians are joining together throughout Hala, sharing our views, planning our future. We are not alone. There are no boundaries. There is so much more to life than we ever imagined. It is there for us all to share. The chosen, the visionaries, the elite.
"As I have been saying,"
St. Dane declared,
"the convergence has broken down the barriers between worlds."
I realized how Namir was able to convince his followers that Hala was real. He showed them. He let them explore other territories, other worlds. It truly was a convergence. Of all the things I had seen in my years as a traveler, this spectacle seemed the most incredible. Yet it was all too real. Ravinia was going to spread throughout Hala, dividing the classes and mixing the destinies of every world. St. Dane's vision was becoming a reality. A group of red shirts hurried in and gently escorted the newly returned travelers and their loved ones away. The spotlight returned to Namir, who stood in the center of the flume. He raised his hand, and the crowd instantly grew quiet. "They will soon share with us the wonders of their travels to another world, wonders that in time you all will have the opportunity to experience yourselves. But first, we must acknowledge the wonder that is about to happen right here on our own world. We are on the verge of seeing our dreams become reality. Tomorrow is a day that will go down in history as the beginning of a new Hala. Tomorrow is the day when, if all goes as we expect, the United Nations will accept us as the voice of our world." An excited cheer went up. These people were out of their minds with joy. Through Namir, St. Dane had done a real number on them. They fully bought into Ravinia and its philosophy. And why not? They were being tempted with the ability to travel to other worlds. It had to be pretty staggering to learn that there was so much more to the universe than they thought, and that they were the only people who were going to be allowed to take advantage of it. I guess the same kind of thing had happened to me, only I saw the darker side to it all. It didn't seem like these people got any hint of that. No way. Namir raised his hands again. "As much as this is a time to celebrate, we must remain humble. There are those who still oppose us, those who do not understand, those who will never share in the glories of Hala. They are deserving of our sympathy." The crowd didn't peep. I didn't feel a whole lot of sympathy going on. Man, who did they think they were? How could they be brainwashed into believing they were so superior? I glanced over to St. Dane. He had a small smile on his face. That was my answer. St. Dane had convinced them. Through Namir, he had seduced them into helping him begin his final assault on Hala. As Alder and I stood in that room, next to the guy who was the architect of this horror, I had no idea what we could do about it. I was beginning to accept the fact that St. Dane was right. I was beaten. Namir continued, "Right now, outside the sacred walls of this conclave, a group has gathered to protest our very existence. Might I say, once the teachings of Ravinia are instituted, such crass showings will be a thing of the past." I saw the people nodding to each other knowingly. Creeps. There will be no more protests, no more dissension, no more violence. There will be only one voice, the voice of Ravinia, the voice of Hala, your voice. "There goes freedom of speech," I said. St. Dane didn't react. "On the eve of such a historic occasion, I would like to invite some of our detractors to join us, to see what we are about, to get a small taste of the wonders of Hala." A concerned murmur went up. The people didn't expect that. How could Namir suggest bringing the unwashed masses into their perfect little temple? Namir raised both hands and added, "I assure you, this will be a night that none of us will forget, nor will our detractors. I beg your patience and understanding." The room lights went on. Namir strode away from the flume, walking directly up the center aisle. He was quickly joined by 6 guards who surrounded him in a protective cocoon. They walked past the adoring yet confused eyes of the Ravinians toward the rear of the room and climbed the stairs. "What's going on?" I asked. Saint Dane left the window and walked to the opposite wall. There was another red drape, much smaller than the one that was pulled back from the window looking down onto the flume. Saint Dane touched the wall panel. The smaller drape slid open the same way, revealing another window. He gestured for us to join him. I didn't want to be anywhere near the guy, but I had to see what was happening. Alder and I reluctantly joined him and looked out of the window to the street below. It was night. We were in the familiar Bronx neighborhood that used to be home to the subway station that held the gate to the flume. Mark and Courtney had described the huge marble structure that we were now in. We were looking down from the 2nd or 3rd floor. I could see the marble steps leading down to the street, a street that was packed with people, protesters. They carried signs that read, "We the People," and "Liberty and Justice for All." According to Saint Dane, these were the bottom feeders of society, the losers who were nothing more than a drain on the world's resources. From where I stood, they looked like regular people, angry regular people. I could hear them chanting, "Stop Namir! Stop Namir!" A long line of red shirts kept the crowd from climbing the stairs. Unlike the dados inside, these guys were armed. They looked pretty imposing with their tasers. Suddenly the chants turned to a chorus of boos. I looked directly down to see that a podium was set up on the stairs that led from the sidewalk up into the conclave building. Whatever was about to happen, it was planned. This wasn't some impromptu moment. A group of red shirts marched down the steps toward the podium and surrounded it. Namir followed soon after and stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of his enemies. "My friends," his voice boomed over speakers. This was definitely planned. They even had speakers set up. The booing grew louder. Namir was patient. He raised his hands to try to quiet them. These people weren't as obedient as the ones inside. They kept screaming and booing him angrily. "Stop Namir! Stop Namir!" Namir stayed cool. "Please," Namir continued, "I understand your concerns." The people were having none of it. Good for them. The boos got louder. This went on for a solid 10 minutes. Namir didn't give up. He kept trying to get them to listen. But that only made them yell louder. Finally, either they got tired of screaming or they actually decided to listen to what he had to say. The crowd settled down enough so that Namir could be heard. "Before you judge, I would like to invite some of you to come inside and see for yourselves what Ravinia is truly about." If it was possible for an entire crowd to be confused, they were. It didn't seem as if they expected that olive branch. Their surprised looks proved that they didn't know what to think about the surprise offer. Namir started pointing to people. "You, and you," he called out. "Bring your daughter. You, young man, join me inside, won't you?" Slowly, each person he pointed to stepped forward and onto the steps of the conclave building. The red-shirt dados parted, allowing them to pass. "Yes, come forward," Namir encouraged from his podium. "Don't be afraid." The people were tentative, but they climbed. A few red shirts met them and escorted them up and into the building. Before the last volunteer went inside, he turned and threw his arms up in a sign of victory and defiance. The little girl who was the guy's daughter did too. The crowd cheered, then started to chant again. It now felt like a charge to those who were headed inside. "Stop Namir! Stop Namir!" I looked to Saint Dane. "Has this ever happened before?" "No," he said coldly.
It is unfortunate that it had to come to this."
He left the window, leaving us with that ominous statement. What was going on? "I don't like this," I whispered to Alder. We followed St. Dane back to the inside viewing window. The Ravinians were as well behaved as the crowd outside was unruly. When Namir appeared at the bottom of the stairs, they turned to him and watched politely. There was no cheering, no chanting, no urging him on. Following Namir were his red shirts, after which came the group of nervous outsiders. A quick count told me there were 10 people, including 3 kids. They didn't seem scared, but they were definitely intimidated. All eyes were on them. They huddled closer to one another for support as they made their way toward the flume. One of them caught sight of the tunnel and nudged another. Soon they all saw the tunnel that led to the territories. Their mouths hung open as they drew closer. Namir was back in his position next to the opening to the flume. "Come now, right this way," he urged the people warmly, invitingly. They were brought to the front of the audience and stood in a group near the mouth of the tunnel.
"There,"
Namir said cordially.
"Thank you for joining us. This is a night you will not soon forget, nor will your friends outside. You are about to experience the true power and majesty of Hala."
Alarms were going off in my head. Something was wrong. Why were these people crowded together in front of the flume like this? Like sheep. The words that Patrick had written suddenly came back to me. N exiles enemies through flume. Was that it? Were these poor people going to be made an example of? Was that going to be his demonstration of the power of Hala? My mind was racing. I had to do something. But what?
"Ah,"
St. Dane exclaimed.
"A few stragglers have arrived."
We looked down to see the red shirts were escorting 2 more outsiders up the aisle. These 2 weren't going as easily as the others. The red shirts held each by the arm and pushed them forward. The 2 didn't fight. They knew it was futile. But they didn't go quietly either. The people in the seats whispered nervously as they passed. They began to realize something was wrong, too. Alder stiffened. My knees went weak. I pressed my face against the glass. My heart raced. The 2 new arrivals were Mark and Courtney. Alder gasped out Patrick's other words.
"Begins with Bronx Massacre." "Yes,"
St. Dane confirmed.
"This is where it truly begins."
Journal number 36, continued. 2nd Earth. I whirled to St. Dane. "What's going on?" I demanded. St. Dane was smug. I hated smug. I've mentioned that before, right?
"You predicted that the enemies of Ravinia would try to stop the movement," he declared. "Once they understand the consequences of their opposition, their will to rebel will disintegrate."
Mark and Courtney were gently yet forcefully pushed into the group. The 12 stood huddled together directly in front of the flume. What they didn't realize was that a group of red shirts was moving in behind them, circling them, cutting off any chance for escape. Namir stood in the center of the flume, facing them. "I am sure you've heard rumors about the worlds of Hala," he announced to the newly arrived group. "It's true. The people in this room have witnessed the wonders. Now, tonight, you will be given the same privilege." He raised his hand. Light flashed from his ring. The people huddled closer as the flume activated. Namir continued, but when he spoke, his benign grandfatherly tone took on a firm, dark edge. He stared the group down and declared, "When those who oppose us learn of what transpired this evening, they too will realize that the rise of Ravinia is inevitable. There can be no opposition." With that, Namir stepped aside to reveal the light that had appeared deep in the recesses of the tunnel. The group stood together, transfixed, staring into it like deer caught in the headlights. Mark and Courtney tried to move away, but were forced back into the group by red shirts who were ready for them. Mark looked concerned, but Courtney was clearly scared. The people in the audience whispered to one another. They were just as clueless about what was going to happen as I was. I take that back. I wasn't totally clueless. I feared that we were about to witness the Bronx Massacre. "Stop it!" I shouted to St. Dane. St. Dane remained calm, with his arms folded.
"Now, why would I do that?"
These people were about to become victims. Whether it was to be exiled somewhere in Hala or to be executed, they would never see this life again. They were to become a warning to the world not to challenge the Ravinians. Namir promised his own people utopia. He was about to promise something much worse to those who opposed him. They were about to be sacrificed in the name of Ravinia. This was the beginning of Ravinia's reign on Earth. And Mark and Courtney were caught in the middle. I ran for a table that sat against the far wall.
"Guards!"
St. Dane called out, barely concerned by my move. The red shirts ran for me. Too late. Alder launched himself at the dados, laying them out flat with his body parallel to the ground. I picked up the table and hurled it at the glass. St. Dane dove out of the way. That was okay. He wasn't the target. I wanted to break glass. The table hit the window, creating a spiderweb of cracks without breaking through. Alder took on both the red shirts, keeping them away from me. His hands were tied, which made it more of a fair fight. I didn't know how long he could keep them occupied. I didn't need long. St. Dane stepped directly in front of the cracked glass and faced me. The growing light from the flume filled the huge room below, casting him in shadow.
"Must you always prolong the inevitable?"
he asked, sounding bored. Yeah, I answered. He was in the perfect spot, right in front of the damaged glass. This was going to feel good. I sprinted right at him. His eyes opened in surprise. He didn't have time to react. I nailed the demon dead on, driving my head into his chest, knocking him back into the glass. The already damaged glass shattered, and the two of us launched into space. We fell through a blizzard of glass, plummeting toward the poor people who were directly below. I grabbed onto St. Dane's jacket, determined to keep him between me and the ground. If anybody was going to get hurt, I wanted it to be him. Not that I had thought it through, but I suppose I had a flash of hope that we'd land on some unsuspecting soft Ravinians who wouldn't be able to get out of the way in time. I don't know what or who we landed on, but we did land. Hard. I was aware of a jumble of arms and legs and screams as people dove out of the way. I was shaken, but okay. I landed squarely on St. Dane and was thrown against the backs of some chairs. When I looked to him, he was gone. No, that's not right. He was still there, but he had changed, transformed. He had become a clean-cut-looking guy with short hair and a red golf shirt. He sat up, not hurt in the slightest. "Stop him!" he shouted, while pointing at me. Nobody listened. They didn't want any part of me. They backed away as if I were radioactive. St. Dane may have considered them perfect. I considered them cowards. Crash! I looked up to see one of the red shirts had been thrown through the window. Alder was back in charge. The guard plummeted down, along with the shattered glass. He landed against the back of a chair and bounced. Seriously, dados bounce. Bedlam was breaking loose. Between the flume activating and bodies crashing down from above, the Ravinians wanted out. They started pushing their way toward the stairs. Bright light filled the room. I didn't have much time. "Courtney!" I shouted. "Mark!" I climbed up on a chair to see the red shirts pushing the group of frightened people toward the flume. Courtney heard me and turned. "Bobby!" she screamed. Her eyes were wild. She was terrified. She tried to fight her way back, but a red shirt grabbed her by the waist and pushed her forward, closer to the flume. By this time, the other people in our group knew something was wrong. They tried to resist, but the ring of dados closed on them, forcing them toward the light. I jumped down from the chair, pushing my way through the fleeing Ravinians, desperate to help these people, to help Mark and Courtney. It was impossible to move. There were too many people pushing against me, moving the other way. I was stuck. The music from the flume grew louder. I climbed back on a chair just as the group of people were shoved into the tunnel, along with several red-shirt dados. Mark fought his way out of the crowd. For a second I thought he was going to get away, but he turned back and tried to grab Courtney's hand to help her. He was more worried about her safety than his own. That was Mark. The move cost him. A red shirt ran up from behind and pushed them both back into the pile of victims. The light enveloped them all. The music was deafening. A moment later, it ended. The light disappeared. The music died. The last sound I heard was the faint echo of Courtney's voice calling Bobby. The Bronx Massacre. They were gone. But to where? Were they dead? Or exiled to some unknown location? Whatever the truth was, Namir had sent a message. Don't mess with the Ravinians, or else. I couldn't let myself believe that Mark and Courtney were dead. I had to tell myself that they were just gone. Thinking any other way would have crushed me. Knowing that they were out there, somewhere, needing my help, gave me new strength. That was good, because I was still in the thick of it. Namir was gone. So was St. Dane. The red shirts weren't. From my perch on the chair, I saw several of them pushing their way through the crowd to get to me. I was about to jump down when I felt my legs go out from under me. The dado that Alder had bounced down from above was still in play. He flipped me to the ground, but I went down kicking. I nailed his knee hard. It may have been a dado, but feeling his knee give way was gruesome. It didn't stop the dado from coming after me. After all, it was a robot. He reached down and was about to grab my shirt when he was suddenly picked up and thrown aside like a puppet. Alder stood over me. His hands were untied.
"We must go,"
he said. I bounced to my feet and looked around to find the best way out. I thought of going for the flume, but there were too many Ravinians and redshirts between us and the tunnel. The only logical way to go was with the flow of people who were desperately pushing to get to the stairs that led up out of there. "Go with the crowd," I instructed Alder. We pushed our way through the mass. The dados were after us. Our best hope was to keep as many Ravinians as possible between us and them. I didn't think the dados would hurt the Ravinians to get to us. After all, they were the chosen people. They were the future. All I cared about was that they would be our shields. Politeness didn't count. I barged past them, not caring if they were offended or bruised or angry. We fought our way to the stairs and climbed to the top. I kept glancing up and around to see how close our pursuers were. They were all still at the bottom of the stairs and having just as much trouble getting through the crowd of Ravinians as we were. I actually thought we were going to make it, until we reached the top of the stairs and ran outside. The line of red-shirt dados that was holding the crowd back was still there. The Ravinians were quickly funneled off to the side of the building, where two columns of red-shirts formed a clear alley for them to hurry past the angry protesters. A line of buses was fired up and waiting to take them away from the madness. We couldn't go that way. The corridor of dados was too narrow. They'd spot us for sure. Even if we made it to a bus, we'd be stopped before we got on. No, we had to break free from the crowd and take our chances on our own. The protesters on the stairs crowded against the line of red shirts. There were thousands of them, all wanting to break through and storm the conclave.
"Pendragon, look!"
Alder shouted. A group of red shirts had climbed up and out of the flume room, headed for us. We were trapped between them and the line of red shirts below us on the stairs. We were moments away from being swarmed. I could only think of one thing to do. I started a riot. "They're not coming out!" I shouted to the angry mob of protesters. "Namir killed them all!" Under normal circumstances, shouting something like that would have been a totally irresponsible thing to do, like shouting fire in a crowded movie theater. These weren't normal circumstances. The effect was instant. The crowd turned violent. While some ran off in fear, most of them pushed past the line of red-shirt dados to storm the conclave. The guards tasered a few in a futile attempt to keep them back. No go. There were too many. The red-shirt dados were stampeded. Now the crowd was headed toward us. We stood frozen on the stairs as the mob came our way. I glanced back up to see the dados who were chasing us had decided it was more important to protect Namir than to recapture Alder and me. They fled back inside the building and were quickly shuttering the large doors. The conclave would survive intact. I wasn't so sure I could say the same for Alder and me. Alder grabbed my arm and took off to our right. I felt like a tailback running behind a pulling guard. Alder picked a spot that wasn't so dense with people and bowled through. I tripped down the stairs, banging into people as I went. Frankly, there were so many of them it kept me upright. I kept bouncing off of people like a pinball. Alder didn't do much bouncing. It was more like mowing. I don't know how many people he ran over. Too many. These people were victims. They had only begun to live a life of misery, thanks to the Ravinians. A life they didn't deserve. I hated to have to start it with violence, but we had to get away. It only took a minute for us to land at the bottom of the stairs in the backside of the surge of people. I grabbed Alder's arm as a signal for him to stop. We both looked back up the stairs to see the crowd banging on the doors of the austere building, desperate to get inside and learn the fate of their friends. "We gotta get away from here," I said to Alder, and took off running. The farther we got away from the conclave building, the sparser the crowd became. We made it. We got away. But our night was only beginning. I saw a subway entrance and led Alder down. I didn't know where to go, other than to get as far away from the Ravinians as possible. We didn't have any money, so we both jumped the turnstile and walked out onto the platform to wait for a train. I had to give Alder credit. He followed me through this strange world without question. I couldn't begin to imagine what must have been going through his head as he experienced the alien world that was Second Earth. Or maybe he wasn't shaken by any of it. After all, there were bigger issues to deal with than learning what a subway train was. Thankfully, a train pulled into the station quickly. The doors opened, and Alder followed me on. We took seats at the rear of the near-empty car. It was the first chance we had to catch our breath since I saw Mark and Courtney being led to... I won't even finish that sentence.
"What do you believe happened to them?"
Alder asked. "I don't know. I can't believe they were all just executed. What would the purpose be?"
"To eliminate their enemies and intimidate those who remain," Alder answered.
"Yeah, but Patrick wrote that Namir exiled his enemies. I said before, exile isn't execution."
"Then why was it called the Bronx Massacre?"
I didn't know. I didn't want to know. What I wanted was to have Mark and Courtney back. I think I was in shock. That's the only way to explain how I could keep going without being crushed by the events we had witnessed. We were traveling downtown into Manhattan. With each stop, the subway car took on more passengers. I didn't know what to do. After having bounced around between territories for so long, it was a strange feeling to be home and not know where to go. I had to think. But the memory of Courtney and Mark being tossed into the flume kept invading my head. If nothing else, I swore to myself that I would find out what happened to them. The train made a stop at a busy station. I didn't know which one. The platform was crowded and people jockeyed to get off and on before the doors closed. At the far end of the subway car, I saw a cop get on. A regular old New York City cop. Nothing strange about that, except that he seemed to be looking for something. Or someone. Or two someones. Us. That wasn't the worst part. The cop wasn't alone. With him was a Ravinian redshirt. They were both searching the faces of the people on the subway car. That meant the Ravinians and the New York City police force were working together. The implication was huge. The Ravinians were already working their way into positions of power with the government. "We gotta go," I whispered, and pulled Alder toward the door. The bell rang. The doors began to close. I threw my arm out and pushed the sliding doors back open. There was no way I'd let us get trapped on a moving train. We weren't going to make it that easy for them. It was my turn to get Alder through the crowd. We couldn't be as bold as we'd been in the Bronx. We didn't want to attract attention. We were being hunted by the Ravinians and now the police. We were fugitives here, just as we were in Stony Brook. It was going to be easier melting into Manhattan than the suburbs, but still, eyes were everywhere. We were going to have to find somewhere safe to hide. I led Alder up and out of the crowded subway station, to discover we were in the middle of busy Times Square. Alder finally balked. I guess being bombarded by the lights and sounds of one of the busiest intersections in Hala was a little much for a knight from a primitive village. He stood, frozen, staring up at the noisy spectacle. I didn't push him. The chances of us being seen by the police were slim. The sidewalks were packed with tourists. No way we'd stand out. At least, that's what I thought, until my eyes settled on the giant video screen that loomed over the crossroads.
"Pendragon, it is you!"
Alder said with surprise. He saw it too. It was a still picture of me that must have been taken from the surveillance cameras at the Sherwood house. It was a grainy blow-up of a video freeze frame, but it was definitely me. As stunning as that was to see, the words superimposed under the picture were even worse. Beneath my admittedly guilty-looking face were the words, "Robert Pendragon, suspected domestic terrorist." It was a news report, a warning. There was no sound, but the words that ran along the bottom of the screen said it all. Wanted in connection with attack on Ravinian conclave. Extremely dangerous. If sighted, do not approach. Contact police. My picture was replaced by another, Alder's. Alder gasped. It was also taken from the surveillance footage. Similar words crawled beneath his picture, warning people to contact the police if these two dangerous terrorists were sighted. The feeling was hard to describe. We were standing in the middle of 1,000 people, yet I suddenly felt alone, naked even. It was like one of those dreams where you find yourself out in public in your underwear. Only we were being accused of a lot more than walking around in boxers. I was a fugitive in my own home.
"They are hunting for us," Alder said in a small voice that was not like him.
"It's worse than that. It means they've gotten to the media. There's no report about a dozen people disappearing in the Bronx, only about us. The Ravinians' influence is everywhere."
"Then we are truly too late,"
Alder said, defeated. The image of Alder on the giant screen was replaced by another. It was the man we had seen on TV that morning in Namir's office. Again, there was no sound to the report, only words that crawled across the lower part of the screen. He was identified as Haig Gastigian, New York University. The scrolling words read, "Professor condemns imminent United Nations decision. Calls for worldwide protest against Alexander Namir and the Ravinians." "Maybe not," I said. "That guy's the leader of the opposition. What's it called? The Foundation."
"What about him?"
"He may be the only person with any power who's left on our side." An hour later, Alder and I arrived in Washington Square Park at the bottom of Fifth Avenue. We walked the whole way, for fear of being spotted on the subway. The park was the center of New York University, the college where Gastigian was a professor. It was pretty simple to find him. I looked in the white pages of a phone book.
Duh.
There weren't a whole lot of Haig Gastigians listed. In fact, there was only one, and it was in Greenwich Village, near the university. The address was on Sullivan Street, a quiet, tree-lined street of brownstones. Finding the address was easy. Getting to see Gastigian wasn't. I knew we had come to the right place when we turned onto Sullivan Street and saw a group of scary-looking guys camped out in front of Gastigian's address under a streetlight. Guards, Alder said, reading my mind. Smart move. It's not healthy to mess with the Ravinians. We saw more men stationed at every street corner, watching for trouble. They were ordinary-looking guys, but not the kind you'd want to mess with. They were big, and they were serious. They must have heard what had happened at the Ravinian compound. These guys looked like the type to want revenge. Act unintimidating, I said, as we walked toward the building.
How do I do that?
Smile, and don't take a defensive stance.
What if they attack us?
Let them. We had only gone a few steps when I sensed that we were being followed. I didn't have to turn around to know there were a couple of big goons shadowing us. I was pretty sure that Gastigian didn't have high-tech surveillance cameras like Namir, but his security was just as effective. Before we could step up to Gastigian's door, a ring of thugs closed around us. Remember, I whispered, unintimidating. Alder put on a totally false smile that looked more creepy than friendly. Lose the smile, I said quickly. Just don't hit anybody.
Can I help you fellas?
Said one of the larger characters who stood between us and the door. We'd like to see Professor Gastigian, I said in my most polite voice. 2 other thugs joined the first. They exchanged looks. It was pretty clear that they had no intention of letting us see him.
Really?
The first guy said sarcastically.
What for?
We have information about the Ravinians he'll want to hear, was my honest answer. The thugs exchanged looks again. They didn't look like rocket scientists. I wasn't sure if that was good or bad.
Tell you what,
the guy said while pressing closer. He had to be 6 inches taller than I was, which made him even taller than Alder. I stood my ground and hoped that Alder wouldn't pop him.
Make an appointment. The professor's a busy guy.
I'm Bobby Pendragon, I blurted out. The guards looked at me blankly. I took a breath and added, We're the ones who attacked the Ravinian conclave tonight. The big guy raised his eyebrows in surprise. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, we heard a man's voice coming through the security speaker in the door.
Send them up.
Apparently, Professor Gastigian had electronic eyes and ears after all. Professor Haig Gastigian lived in a simple, neat apartment that had a cool view of Washington Square Park. It was exactly the kind of place I expected a professor of philosophy to live. It was small and full of books. Alder and I had to move several volumes off the couch so we could sit. Gastigian entered the living room carrying a tray with a teapot and 3 cups. He treated us like welcome guests. The guard who sat at the door, though, let us know we weren't completely accepted. Gastigian looked to be in his 60s, with dark skin and a head full of pure white hair that he combed straight back. He wore big square glasses right out of the 70s that made his eyes look twice their size. He wore a buttoned-up sweater, a blue bow tie, and walked with a kind of stoop and shuffle. If I were making a movie and had to cast a guy to play a philosophy professor, Gastigian would get the nod.
Is it true what they say?
He began.
Are you terrorists?
Depends on your definition, I answered. Are we trying to spread terror? No. Are we trying to stop the Ravinians? Absolutely. So to them, we're terrorists. I guess that makes you a terrorist, too. Gastigian gave me a sly smile.
Call me Haig,
he said. I think he liked me. That was good. People who liked me were in short supply lately. He poured us tea. I was never much of a tea guy, but I was starving. Alder was too. We didn't waste any time in downing our cups and polishing off the stale cookies he put out. Haig took his own cup and sat back in his easy chair, totally relaxed.
It never ceases to amaze me how gullible people can be. The promises that Namir feeds the world on a daily basis are shameless. He tells people what they want to hear, like a politician running for office. It would all be laughably harmless if people weren't actually listening, and if his ideology didn't involve the persecution of so many. Those are the people I speak for, the people who will be left out of his grand scheme. There are plenty of us, I'll tell you that. We aren't going to sit still and let this fascist consume us."
He took a sip of tea and continued.
"So tell me, gentlemen, how is it that you found yourselves giving Namir a run for his money, I must say I've never had terrorists to tea before."
I hadn't thought about what I would say to Haig. He might have been the last person in the world who had any kind of hope of slowing down the Ravinians, but I was afraid that when he heard what I had to say, he'd throw us out. Still, we had to take the chance. I decided that the only way to go was to tell him the truth. "You're not going to like what we have to say," I began.
"I don't like much of anything I hear these days. Try me."
"Okay. The trouble is, the things that Namir is saying aren't fantasy. You may have trouble believing it, but it's all true. Hala is real. There are other worlds besides our own. You said you speak for the people who will be left out of his grand scheme. You have no idea how many people that really is. What's happening here is going to happen everywhere else. If he isn't stopped now, it will be the end of it all." Haig held the teacup to his lips, but didn't take a sip. He stared at me for a long moment, placed the cup back onto the saucer, put the saucer back on the table, then sat back and folded his arms across his chest.
"You have my attention," he said.
Alder and I spent the next hour telling Haig the highlights of what we thought he needed to know. We skipped over many details of the struggle with St. Dane. In fact, we skipped over St. Dane altogether. What we concentrated on was Namir and his use of the flume to show his chosen people the other worlds of Hala, and how he planned on creating a super race of achievers to control all that exists, at the expense of those who might have less to offer. Haig listened intently, more so than the guard at the door, who I think fell asleep. Haig never took his eyes off us. Besides trying to digest what we were saying, I figured he was also trying to judge if we were crazy or not. I wouldn't have blamed him if he decided we were. I ended by saying, "What happened tonight at the conclave was the beginning of something evil."
"The Bronx Massacre,"
Alder added. "There's no other way to say it," I continued. "If given the power, Namir will do the same to anyone who threatens him. The fear of being shipped up there and tossed into the flume will get his enemies to back down. I think that if the United Nations accepts Ravinia, there won't be anything stopping Namir. That's why we came to you. You have the ear of the opposition. You are the voice of the Foundation, the voice of reason. Something must be done to stop Namir. Now, today." I grabbed my cup of tea and remembered it was empty. I didn't care. I had to do something other than look into Haig's questioning glare. The man sighed and stood up. He ran his hands through his white hair. He was sweating. He was shaken. "I know," I added. "It's impossible to believe."
"Not so impossible,"
Haig said. He stood before us and pushed up his sleeve. On his arm was the Ravinian star tattoo. Alder sat up straight,